Hello, Endeavor here. I love Mafia films, and I'm by no means alone in that sentiment. Who doesn't love them? It's one of the most popular film genres out there, with films like The Godfather often making people's top 10 favorite movies list. There seems to be something about organized crime, gangs of highly competent yet ruthless men cheating the system and violently working their way to the top that appeals to everyone. Most mob films are set in early or mid-20th century America, and over the last century, the Mafia has become a part of the American mythos. The Italian immigrant who moves to America in the early 20th century, he makes his fortune and rises to power illegally selling alcohol during the Prohibition era. Things get bloody when he goes to war with the rival Irish gang of the city, and it ends with him either leaving behind his life of crime or with a bullet in the back of his head. It's a story as cliché as can be, yet remains one that we all enjoy, myself included. A question that has been on my mind of late is, why are mob films so popular? And what views of the world are advanced by these films? What got me asking these questions was several live streams from the last few months. One of them was a stream between Academic Agent and Morgoth on the 1983 version of the film Scarface. The others were two streams I took part in on Settler Lament's channel, along with Charlemagne and Distributist on right-wing and left-wing themes in fiction. The question of Mafia films came up in one, and I wasn't really sure where they fit in. Does the genre lean left or right? I think the answer to these two questions is the same. The mobster film seems to have something for everyone. They appeal to both the right and the left because they're filled with a mix of both right-wing and left-wing themes. And I think that the success of the genre owes a lot to this, which is why it's an interesting genre to analyze. From the left's perspective, the Mafia film can be seen as a critique of capitalism and the American dream. The mobster is portrayed as the result of a broken capitalist system where those who lie, cheat, and steal make their way to the top, and those who are honest are left at the bottom. The mobster makes his fortune off exploiting the vices of the common folk. And he has so much money and power that he's above the law. A common theme in mob films is the corruption of law enforcement. The mob boss often has the police on his payroll, suggesting that money really is power in America. This was the consensus that Academic Agent and Morgoth came to on the film Scarface, that it is a left-wing critique of the individualistic American dream of 1980s Reagan-era America. That the character of Tony Montana gained the materialistic ideal of prosperity of the United States by being as violent and ruthless as possible and betraying the proletariat in Latin America. But the mobster can also be portrayed as a rebel against the system. He could be seen as the guy fighting back against the elites and the exploitative capitalist system which seems to keep the common folks poor. The 1967 film Bonnie and Clyde portrays the legendary crime duo from the 1930s almost as some kind of folk heroes of their time. Or the mob henchman could be seen as a victim himself of an unjust society which has driven him to crime, and that he's no worse than the corrupt politicians and law enforcement officers that govern it. The left-wing themes found in Mafia films are all old left themes. The left that was more concerned with class and economics than things like race, gender, and sexuality like the new left. And that's because almost all mobster films also have many strongly right-wing themes in them. The Mafia, as shown in pop culture, is staggeringly illiberal. Films like The Godfather, Goodfellas, or Scarface portray a conception of man as a savage creature who will fight tooth and nail to make his way to the top. It certainly doesn't show man as good in nature. This is made clear by the sheer level of violence that's commonplace in the genre. But while the Mafia is brutal, it is certainly not anarchistic. After all, this is not random acts of violence and criminality from petty lowlifes. It is organized crime. The mob functions as a well-oiled machine. It's a business like any other, but works outside the purview of the law. These crime organizations are extremely hierarchical, with the Don at the top wielding enormous power over his subordinates. There is certainly no egalitarianism to be found. While they are criminals, the mob is portrayed as having a deep code of honor amongst mobsters. It's an organization with its own virtues of respect, loyalty, and work ethic. The Mafia in these films is completely antithetical to the modern progressive values of the left. It is entirely male-dominated, and the mobster archetype himself is hyper-masculine. Feminism just doesn't exist in this world. And each of these competing crime organizations, which operate above the boundaries of civil society, are divided along ethnic lines. There's the Italian gang, the Irish gang, there's the black gang, the Cuban gang, and the Jewish gang. Ethnic loyalty to one's own in-group is the foundation which holds the Mafia together. And this really goes against the modern egalitarian notion of diversity, because it suggests that man in nature is tribal. After all, the Mafia operates outside the law, so when left to their own devices, men will form tribes and compete with rivals for tribal dominance, not live together in some multicultural harmony. This theme of ethnic loyalty in mobster films makes them feel more authentic because this is how humans function in general. You really couldn't make a Mafia film that lines up with modern progressive values without it being absolute shit. Just imagine an anti-racist, multicultural Mafia with a woman of color, feminist Dawn, and a transgendered consigliere. It just wouldn't work because everyone would know that it was completely forced and not reflective of how a violent crime organization would actually operate. I don't watch many TV series, but the one show in the past decade that I've watched from start to finish and thoroughly enjoyed was Boardwalk Empire. It's a Mafia series set in Prohibition-era America. It combined both historically based and fictional storylines set in the era. What initially attracted me to the series and why I actually sat through 5 seasons, a rarity for me, was the setting. I love Prohibition-era America, or just the interwar years in general. The aesthetics, the culture, the history, I love almost everything about the 2 decades between the world wars. Maybe I'll do another video in the future on the interwar years and why they appeal to me so much, but for the purposes of this video, the Prohibition era is the quintessential backdrop for films and series about the Mafia. It was the era that gave birth to the mob's place in the American mythos, with legendary figures such as Al Scarface Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, or George Remus creating the image of the mobster, now famous in pop culture. Many myths we form around historical archetypes which shape popular culture are formed post hoc. The image of medieval knights, cowboys, or pirates we've been given through fictional storytelling very rarely lines up with how these figures would have actually been perceived by those living in their time, let alone how they actually were. But in the case of the mob in the early 20th century, these myths, which I will remind you are only myths, persisted while these figures they're based on were alive and at their height. The archetype of the bootlegger was romanticized as far back as the Prohibition era itself. Many of them were celebrities of their time. The image of the larger-than-life crime boss who lives according to his own rules was appealing to many, and even more so in the era of Prohibition. He provided people the liquor which had previously been commonplace in their lives but was now forbidden by law. The bootlegger made the speakeasy subculture of the era possible. In the early 1930s, at the start of the Great Depression, when millions of people were out of work and poor, the gangster could be seen as a rebel against the failing economic system. Perhaps the bootlegger could even be seen as a folk hero in some respects. So even at the time, the mythos of the mobster captured the imagination of the American people. But the horrific violence inflicted by these gangs made many question the morality of this romanticized image of the Mafia. Events like the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre on February 14, 1929, gave the public a glimpse into the violent nature of the bootlegging trade, when 4 members of Al Capone's South Side Gang gunned down 7 members of the Irish North Side Gang in Chicago. Were these really rebels against a corrupt system serving the people, or just cold-blooded killers? This is the context in which one of the earliest films in the genre, the 1931 classic The Public Enemy, was made. The film attempts to deal with this very question, but where exactly does it stand as controversial? As the title of the film would suggest, it claims to be an anti-crime film, one which condemns the violent life of crime lived by mobsters, but many have claimed that the film does the opposite, that it shows the life of the mobster as cool and that it's sympathetic to the archetype. After watching the film, I researched what others had said about it in the past and found that I disagreed with the most common interpretation. So I want to delve into this film and see what is it really saying about the world. It may come as surprising to some, but my favorite film in the entire Mafia genre is not The Godfather, it's not Goodfellas, it is The Public Enemy. First, I want to explain the context in which I saw the film and what questions were on my mind. We live in a time of disorder. The year 2020 has been the most chaotic year in living memory. The world was struck by a global pandemic and an ensuing economic crash. During the lockdown, in which I was confined to my room for months on end, I must have sat through 50 different films to fill the time. one of which was The Public Enemy. I saw the film in June of this year 2020, when what was already a chaotic year became oh so much more chaotic. June was the month when the Black Lives Matter riot swept across the United States and even spilled into other Western countries in the wake of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And one dynamic I saw play out is one which I've seen many times before, one that is fundamental to the divide between the left and the right. That is the struggle between liberation and order. The left came out in full support of Black Lives Matter, a movement rife with criminality in the form of vandalism, looting, and in some cases violence. The narrative from the left was that this was backlash against centuries of racial injustice in the United States, and that the goal of equality justifies the actions of Black Lives Matter. They claim that the system of law enforcement they live under is unjust, thus breaking unjust laws in the pursuit of equality is just. The right, on the other hand, came out against the BLM movement. Almost all conservatives, no matter how cucked, gave at least verbal condemnation of the riots. Everyone ranging from the dissident right to Con Inc., even PragerU and TPUSA, as dishonest as they are on the race issue, will still come out against such criminality. They claim that regardless of the goals of the rioters, such chaos and disorder is never justified. Because a belief in law and order is fundamental to a right-wing worldview. Now, I want to make it clear that I do not believe that the goals of leftist racial politics are legitimate, nor do I think they have been legitimate for the last 75 years. I believe that the left's narrative on race is based on lies, and their racial agenda is evil. So I do not believe that BLM has any moral leg to stand on, but that's not the question I want to take on here. What I want to look at is this fundamental divide between the left and the right. The question of what is more important, law and order or liberation from injustice? And to do that, I want to look at a time when, at least in my opinion, this was a more morally ambiguous question. 1931. The United States was in the worst of the Great Depression. Millions were poor and out of work. After a decade of prosperity, the capitalist system seemed to be failing on all levels. Prohibition was in its dying days. The repeal of the 18th Amendment, that being the amendment that brought in prohibition, was beginning to look more and more likely. Prohibition was increasingly unpopular, and the federal government badly needed the tax revenue that the sale of legal alcohol could provide. Now, there is a lot of libertarian bullshit told about prohibition, which we mustn't fall for. I myself consume alcohol, and obviously I don't support criminalizing it, but it is true that the consumption of alcohol declined during prohibition. It declined greatly in the early years, but it began to rise again in the later ones. Public drunkenness, death from cirrhosis, and other alcohol-related issues declined after the passage of Prohibition. Violent crime increased, and the mob played a part in that, but it was also a time of rapid urbanization, which was responsible for a lot of the increase in crime. It's true that the mob made a fortune off of bootlegging, but the mob had existed before Prohibition and just moved on to other rackets which were even more profitable after. So we have to dismiss the libertarian lie that Prohibition caused more people to drink alcohol or that banning things doesn't work in general, because it's simply not true. Having said that, I think it's safe to say that the prohibition of alcohol was a failed social movement and that it was an unjust law. So, at a time when the honest man is broke, feeling exploited by the rich, is the bootlegger any worse than the powers that be, or is he even a rebel against an unjust system? This is the question that the film The Public Enemy tries to answer. The film tells the story of Tom Powers, played by James Cagney, and his life of crime in early 20th century Chicago. It's a fictional story based on an unpublished novel titled Beer and Blood, which was written by two newspapermen who had witnessed the violent gang warfare in Chicago at the time. The Public Enemy was directed by William A. Wellman and released in April 1931, at the same time as Al Capone's infamous tax evasion trial was ongoing. It was released in what is known as the pre-code era of Hollywood, the time between the widespread adaptation of dialogue in films in 1929 and the introduction of the Motion Picture Production Code, or the Hays Code, in 1934, which regulated the subject matter of films produced by Hollywood. It was considered an extremely violent film for its era and really pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable at the time. The film starts in 1909. Tom Powers and his friend Matt Doyle are petty thieves as teenage boys, stealing loot. Powers is a second-generation American, son of Irish immigrants living in Chicago. Tom and Matt are involved with a gangster they meet at a local saloon named Putty Nose, whom they sell their stolen loot to. In 1915, Putty Nose finally gives them a chance to join his gang. He persuades them to pull off a heist of a fur warehouse along with another gang member, Larry Dalton. They attempt to rob the warehouse at night, but a cop is alerted who shoots and kills Dalton. The cop pursues Tom and Matt, who gun him down. Having killed a cop, they attempt to get refuge in the gang's hideout in the saloon, only to find that Putty Nose has skipped town to avoid the heat from the failed robbery and the cop's death. With their gang disbanded, they try to start honest work as truck drivers. Tom and Matt grow tired of working low-paying jobs and join an Irish gang in 1917, led by mob boss Paddy Ryan. They start with small-time rackets, but strike it big in 1920 when Prohibition is enacted, and they get into the bootlegging business with Ryan's gang. Tom and Matt work as enforcers for a noted gangster in Ryan's gang named Nails Nathan. As their newfound illegal business venture prospers, Tom and Matt begin to rake in the cash. They begin to dress in fancy suits, drive hot rods, and they're more successful with women. But the film also shows the immoral practices of the mob. There's a scene where Tom and Matt visit one of Paddy Ryan's so-called clients. They go to a speakeasy whose owner is buying beer from one of Ryan's rivals, Schemer Burns. Tom asks for a drink only to spit it in the owner's face, demanding to know why he's buying from Burns' gang and not from Ryan's. The owner tries to explain that the Burns gang said the same thing, but Tom slaps him in the face and opens all the taps, emptying the kegs of the rival gang's booze. He reluctantly agrees to buy 2 kegs from Tom, who replies that he needs to buy 5. This scene establishes the ruthless nature of the bootlegging business. For an audience in 1931, many of whom had probably attended a speakeasy at some point, this scene shows that the mobsters aren't these modern-day Robin Hoods, but selfish criminals, and that the speakeasy subculture is run on extortion and violence. A fascinating character in the film is Tom Powers' straight-laced brother, Mike Powers. While Tom represents the hoodlum, Mike represents the honest man, the law-abiding citizen. At the beginning of the film, when they're young, he calls out Tom for stealing a pair of roller skates, which he gives to a girl, hoping to get her to like him. By 1915, Mike is working as a streetcar driver while attending night school in order to support their widowed mother. He enlists in the army in 1917 when the United States declares war on Germany, seeing it as his civic duty to fight for his country. While he's off at war, Mike leaves Tom to look after their mother, who is completely unaware of Tom's criminal activities. Now that he has an honest job, Mike tries to convince Tom to give up crime, but ultimately fails. He returns from military service in 1920 to find that Tom has become financially successful. Their mother is under the impression that Tom's wealth is from work in politics, but Mike is informed by a cop that he's been working with Nails Nathan, and that the money is actually from bootlegging. There's an absolutely fantastic scene in the film where the family is having a welcome home party for Mike. Tom and Matt bring a big keg of beer which they place at the center of the table. While eating dinner, Mike sits there staring at the keg in absolute rage. As a man who believes in law and order, to Mike, the keg represents everything that is evil in society. Matt tries to break the tension by offering a toast to Mike's health, but he refuses. Tom comments that beer is not good enough for him, to which Mike replies there's not only beer in the keg, there's beer and blood. He then picks up the keg and smashes it against an end table, calling Tom and Matt murderers. Tom retorts that Mike killed in the war, saying, "You didn't get them medals by holding hands with them Germans." This, in my opinion, is the most important scene in the movie, because it establishes several moral ambiguities and a contrast between the two brothers. And it's even more interesting when considering the historical context in which this film was released. By 1931, the early days of the Great Depression and the dying days of Prohibition, not only dry laws, but the entirety of law in the United States was losing legitimacy. Tom is a mobster. He's an outlaw against a system under which, in 1931, the average American was broke and hungry. And was selling alcohol really a crime? The film was also released 13 years after the Great War, when the American public was very weary of war. Is there a difference between killing for an army and killing for the mob? Mike, on the other hand, is a force for order. The film makes it clear that Mike's moral objection to bootlegging isn't drinking itself, it's the violent and amoral practices of such an illegal industry. Whether or not drinking alcohol is moral is irrelevant because the wickedness involved in acquiring it cannot be justified. The difference between the soldier and the mobster is that one acts on behalf of his country and serves a function in an ordered society, while the other acts purely on his own behalf and brings chaos to society. The difference is lawfulness, a requirement for a stable civilization, To Mike, the barrel sitting on the table represents evil, an enemy of civilization. This is the turning point in the film. Both Tom's career as a gangster and his sanity go into a steep decline from here. Despite his wealth, Tom is never happy. The film is infamous for a scene when he's eating breakfast with his girlfriend. He's incredibly irritable and annoyed at everything she says. He picks up a grapefruit off the table and shoves it in her face, in what is known as the grapefruit scene. Tom is unable to ever form meaningful relationships and just jumps from woman to woman, leaving one for another only to get bored and to repeat the same process over again. Tom Powers becomes an evil and ruthless man. He spots Putty Nose at a restaurant, the gangster who had abandoned him and Matt after the botched robbery years earlier. They follow him home to his apartment and force their way in. At the beginning of the film, when Tom and Matt are boys in 1909, Putty Nose is shown entertaining a group of boys their age in the saloon by playing the song Hesitation Blues on piano. Now pleading for his life, he begs them to remember the old times. He goes over to his piano and plays the same song he was shown playing for them in 1909. This scene is shot extremely well. As Tom walks behind Putty Nose as he plays on the piano and draws his gun, we're shown Matt's reaction to what happens next. The song is abruptly interrupted by 2 gunshots, followed by the sound of Putty Nose's body hit the piano as he falls to the floor. Matt stands by the door, shocked at what they had done. As Tom walks out of the apartment, Matt stands there for a moment, staring in disbelief. Often in gangster films, where there's a scene where the mobster guns down his enemy, it's portrayed as badass. But that's not the case in The Public Enemy. Here, it's just cold-blooded murder. Because that's what the bootlegging business is, and that's really all Tom Powers is. He's a murderer. But despite all that, he still feels a duty of care for one person, his mother. He returns to the house and offers her a wad of cash. He still feels he's responsible to help her financially, and she's happy to see him. She has the unconditional love that all mothers have for their children, despite his life of crime. But his brother Mike isn't so forgiving. He tells Tom that they won't accept his money, stating that he should keep it because it's all he's good for. While their mother has the very feminine virtue of endless care for her children, Mike employs a more masculine form of justice. Despite Tom being family, to simply forgive him while he has not changed his evil ways would be a betrayal of the values of law and order that Mike stands for. He refuses to accept any money that's been acquired through blood. Mike punches Tom in the face and tells him that he's not welcome in their home. As I mentioned at the beginning, a common theme in Mafia films is loyalty, with different gangs usually being united by ethnicity. Loyalty to a brotherhood is noble, but the film shows how criminality bastardizes this otherwise healthy virtue. Nails Nathan dies, not by murder but in a riding accident by being thrown off a horse. Tom goes to the stable, buys the horse for $1,000, a lot of money back then, just to shoot it in the head, showing just how insane Tom has become. After Nails Nathan's death, Paddy Ryan's gang is weakened. His rival, Schemer Burns, launches a war against the Ryan gang. They park 2 machine guns across the street from Ryan's hideout. As Tom and Matt are leaving, Burns' men open fire. Matt is shot dead. Tom narrowly escapes. To avenge the death of his best friend, Tom storms into Schemer Burns' headquarters and attempts to kill him. He fails and is shot himself. Though badly wounded, he survives and is taken to the hospital. He didn't really have any kind of plan to assassinate Burns. He just barged in, guns blazing, hoping to kill as many members of the Burns gang as possible. He's so accustomed to breaking the law that he has lost all self-restraint, simply acting on every impulse. His loyalty to Matt or Nails Nathan would have been honorable under different circumstances, but the immorality of the bootlegging trade made him a slave to his passion. So he wasn't able to handle the livid emotion of having lost a friend and did something rash. And it cost him. As he collapses in the street, pumped full of lead, he says, "I ain't so tough," realizing he isn't invincible after all. His family comes to visit him in the hospital. With his actions finally having caught up to him, he promises to give up his life of crime and reconciles with his brother Mike. Once released from the hospital, he promises to come home. But as Tom's family awaits his release, Mike is visited by Paddy Ryan. He informs him that the Burns gang has kidnapped Tom from the hospital. Ryan promises Mike to bring Tom back, saying that he had offered Burns that he quit the racket entirely on the condition that Tom is returned to his family. Having had his gang destroyed, Ryan has had enough of the bootlegging trade. Mike nervously waits for word from Ryan with the rest of his family, who are unaware that Tom has been kidnapped. He receives a call which he assumes is from one of Ryan's men telling him that they're bringing Tom home. Mike tells his mother the good news. Delighted, she goes upstairs to prepare a bedroom for her son, whom she loves so dearly. As their mother excitedly prepares Tom's room, there's a knock on the door. Mike opens it, only to have the corpse of his brother fall at his feet. And I must say that for a film released in 1931, this final scene is haunting. The film ends with the following text. The end of Tom Powers is the end of every hoodlum. The public enemy is not a man, nor is it a character. It's a problem that sooner or later we, the public, must solve. The Public Enemy was a controversial film upon its release in 1931, both due to the level of violence in the film and due to the accusation by many that, contrary to the expressed intent of the film, it actually romanticizes the Mafia. It was one of the films that prompted the adoption of the Hays Code only 3 years later. It was one of the films that gave birth to the Hollywood gangster. When I researched others' takes on the film, I found that many critics over the years have said that it's sympathetic to the mobster archetype, and that the supposed social message is just a cover to meet the sensibilities of the time. So, is the proclaimed moral of the Public Enemy disingenuous? Does it portray the mobster not as a menace, but as a folk hero? In my interpretation, no. I believe that the anti-mob moral of the story is genuine. Perhaps it is because I'm far more accustomed to violence in films than audiences in 1931 were. Or maybe it's because at the time of release, the Hollywood mobster was a new cultural phenomenon, while for me, it's been an iconic part of pop culture for all of my time. There were two other films of the pre-code era, Little Caesar, which also came out in 1931, and the original Scarface, which came out in 1932, which were also accused of being sympathetic toward the Mafia. For those two films, I do think the accusation holds more weight, but not so much with the Public Enemy. I will admit that the clothes, the guns, the cars in the film are cool as hell, especially considering the fact they weren't a recreation, but of the era the film was made in. But upon analyzing the themes of the Public Enemy, it is ultimately a condemnation of the lifestyle of the mobster. It's common for Mafia films to portray the Don as a killer, but the lower-ranking members in a more sympathetic light. That's not the case in The Public Enemy. Tom never makes it to the top. He's a henchman. But the film makes it clear that he's not the victim of a wider societal problem. He himself embodies the problem. And even as he collapses in the street having been shot, or as he lies in the hospital bed swearing to change, I felt no sympathy for him. My sympathies were with his family. Even though Tom Powers became wealthy and powerful for a short time, none of it brought him any happiness. Because happiness and fulfillment can only come through the pursuit of the good. His life of crime brought heartache to his family, who should have been the ultimate good which he strived to protect. Tom Powers isn't a Robin Hood figure, he's a scoundrel whose criminality ran contrary to all that is good. I'm not a relativist. I believe that art should have one objective meaning. But the value of that meaning is what it suggests is true about the world, and depending on the circumstances of the time, that can have a very different impact in a different era. Regardless of how some may have interpreted the film in the past, it is one we can claim as ours today. This brings me back to the overarching question of the morality of order versus liberation. And this, I believe, is the real insight of the film, The Public Enemy. In a time of crisis, be it 1931 or 2020, when the system is broken and the powers that be are failing to uphold their duty to the public, what is the way forward? The answer is order. What the public needs is the restoration of stability in their lives, to be governed by institutions with a renewed commitment to upholding goodness. That cannot come through chaos, it can only come through order. When civilization is in crisis, it does not need men like Tom Powers to tear it down. It needs men like Mike Powers to take a stand for civilization. In a time when everyone is dissatisfied with the system under which they are ruled and the law is losing legitimacy, it can be easy to sympathize with those who break the law, whether it's the bootlegger in 1931 or the rioter in 2020. But to restore a healthy society, the public needs law and order. The hoodlum is not a folk hero, nor is he the victim of societal problems himself. He is simply a criminal. He is the enemy of all goodness in society. He is the public enemy. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on Twitter or Telegram, and if you'd like to support my work with a donation, you can do that too. All links are in the description. Thank you for listening. Till next time, Endeavor.